Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Doug Wazinski, and I'll be your host this afternoon for our topic, Predictive Analytics, its intervention that matters. I am currently the partner in charge of Plant Moran's Information Technology Consulting Practice and will be hosting today's series, which will be led by Dale Saunders. If you have any questions, please feel free to submit them at any time using the Q&A widget located at the bottom of your console. You can also download today's slides by clicking on the resource widget, also located at the bottom of your console. Today's webinar will be recorded and added to our website in a few days for on-demand viewing. This is a CPE-eligible session. Throughout the webcast, polling questions will appear. Participants must respond to at least 75% of these polling questions and have an accrued viewing time of at least 50 minutes in order to receive CPE credit. Archived, on-demand webinars are not eligible for CPE credit. To obtain your certificate, click on the CPE widget located at the bottom of the console at the end of the session.
Thank you.
I am absolutely thrilled to introduce our topic leader today, Dale Saunders. Dale is currently the Senior Vice President for Strategy at Health Catalyst in Salt Lake City. He has been one of the most influential leaders in healthcare analytics and data warehousing since its earliest days in the industry, starting at Intermountain Healthcare, where he was the Chief Architect for Enterprise Data Warehouse and the Regional Director of Medical Informatics. He has also been the CIO for Northwestern University's Physician Group and the Chief Architect of Northwestern's EDW. He also has served as a CIO for the National Health System of the Cayman Islands, where he helped lead the implementation of a new care delivery process that is now associated with the accountable care in the United States. Prior to his healthcare experience, Dale has a diverse 14-year career that includes duties as a CIO in the U.S. Air Force and nuclear threat assessments for the NSA. He holds a BS degree in chemistry and a minor in biology, and is a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Information Systems Engineering Program. I'm sure you will find Dale's presentation not only informative, but also thought-provoking and entertaining. Dale?
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Doug. Pleasure to be with you all today, and hopefully you'll find this a good use of your time. I think it's an interesting topic on different levels. Predictive analytics is starting to become more mainstream and more commonly discussed topic across all industries now and beyond healthcare. And so we'll touch a little bit on applications of predictive analytics in healthcare, but as well in manufacturing and national intelligence and military and that sort of thing. I would like to jump into the first poll question to get a feel for everyone's understanding and kind of baseline for predictive analytics in your organizations. So if you could take a minute to respond to this polling question about your organization's use of predictive analytics. Even though it's worded towards a healthcare environment, I'd appreciate you extrapolating that to your industry, even though it may not be healthcare related.
Dale, I'm sure you're going to be having the audience share with the audience your perspectives on the impact on predictive analytics in other industry segments as well. Is there one that's trailing behind healthcare in terms of its adoption of BI or predictive analytics that you've seen?
Well, any field or any any industry that is trying to predict human behavior is typically challenged by predictive analytics. And retail is one of those, actually. Our belief and our hype around predictive analytics when it comes to predicting human behavior is is not that advanced. So here are the results of the question here. Let's see what we've got. Okay, so about half not using any that they know about. some experimenting, no improvement seen, some small number of use cases. So this is about what I would have expected. And a handful, 4.8%, using predictive analytics on a large number of use cases. Well, it would be great if during the course of the presentation, of those of you that are actively using predictive analytics might make some comments in the Q&A session. That would be great. All righty, let's jump into the rest of the slides here. I want to begin by acknowledging a couple of folks that have had significant influence on my thinking and my career in this context. Dr. Eric Siegel at Columbia and Ron Galt at Aerospace Corporation, formerly at TRW and Northrop Grumman. And you'll kind of understand that connection to my career here in just a few minutes. The aerospace industry and military has been using predictive analytics for a number of years. And there's good news and bad news about that in terms of what we've learned from it. So this diagram is my cartoon depiction of my wandering career in predictive analytics. It started out in 1980 when a group of us taking a very basic computer programming class in college tried to predict who might be most likely to drop out of college. And we had a lot of fun with that, and it turned out that the algorithms were pretty good. We did a fairly good job of predicting who might drop out. After college, I went into the Air Force, into Officers Candidate School, and went into information systems engineering in the Air Force, and was exposed to predictive analytics around satellite failures. Obviously, you want to avoid those failures as much as you possibly can, and you want to engineer around those in the ground segment so that you don't have failures after you've deployed those satellites. So that was very interesting, and my first introduction to what I would consider very formal analysis of predictive analytics. Then I went on later to work as a member of the battle staff at SAC headquarters in Omaha, Nebraska, both in the ground as well as in an airborne command post called Licking Glass and Kneecap. And at that time, we were all consumed. This was in the 80s. We were all consumed about trying to predict whether the Soviet Union might attack in a nuclear sense. And you'll see, I'll talk about the parallels of that. They're oddly familiar and oddly similar to what the decision-making that we encounter in healthcare. Then in 1991, National Security Agency contracted with my team, and Ron Galt was the leader of that team. After the demise of the Soviet Union, we were trying to understand different kinds of nuclear threats at that time. The command and control structure of the Soviet Union had broken down. Terrorism in a formalized sense was really starting to take off and become much more organized, and they were the national technical means that were previously associated with nations were now being dispersed out to small organizations. So we applied predictive analytics in that setting, trying to protect U.S. nuclear forces from terrorist attacks. And again, that's where the complexity of human behavior really became a challenge for us to try to predict. I went on to work for Intel and developed an analytics and decision support system for them that was trying to predict the relationships between quality and supply chain. And that was enormously successful. That system ended up saving Intel somewhere in the neighborhood of $35 million in the first year after we deployed it. Then, in a strange way, I moved on to healthcare in 2001, and that dashed line right there is the symbolic. By the way, that's a Morse code for SOS. And I've been broadcasting SOS from healthcare ever since. Healthcare I saw an opportunity for better computerization of healthcare as a consequence of a program I was working on at the Pentagon. But boy, it's been a slow journey trying to improve decision-making in healthcare. I started that in about 2001. We were trying to predict the best antibiotic therapy for patients. That's a dancing antibiotic pill down there you see below that. We had some success with that algorithm, but it it also took an enormous amount of time and intellectual property invested into a very, very specific use case. And so the return on investment for that was questionable. Then we went on to predicting pneumonia cases, other chronic diseases in 2007. Then in the Cayman Islands, in 2010, we were trying to predict financial risk on a per-patient basis. And now in 2014, things have really taken off. It's kind of the Wild West, and we're trying to predict all sorts of things under the moniker of big data, not just in healthcare, but in society in general. And so that's my wandering journey, and I'll take you through a little more of those details in these upcoming slides. So one of the key themes that I'd like to leave behind today is the notion that action matters. So quite often what you'll see in organizations is kind of a love affair with predictive analytics without any associated strategy for intervention. And so predictive analytics without actions and interventions are useless and potentially libelous, right? They can expose you to liability if you predict things that you don't take action upon, which is some of the issues that we ran up against in NSA, where we were predicting terrorist activity with pretty high probability, but no realistic means of intervening. So it creates some very interesting cultural and organizational issues, predictive analytics does, and you need to be aware of those as you go into it. So if you're going into a situation with the notion you're going to predict something, you have to couple that with what are we going to do to intervene and take action once we see it. The other key theme today about humans is that they're very unpredictable. Like the weather, it's inherently difficult to predict with a computer. Socioeconomics matters in healthcare significantly. So a lot of what we're trying to predict and improve healthcare outcomes and things like that, about 80% of what affects healthcare lies outside the traditional boundaries of healthcare delivery. So we may find out through predictive analytics that economic factors in a population of patients is the most important thing to health outcomes. But we don't have much of a way for influencing that yet as a healthcare delivery organization. That's more of a national issue that we have to address. Missing data is also a problem with predictive analytics, especially in healthcare. We think that we have a lot of data in healthcare, but in comparison to other industries, very little, in fact. And so this missing data is a little bit like a puzzle that has missing pieces to it, and you see part of the picture and you see part of it starting to emerge, but you're still not exactly sure what you're seeing. And that's the situation we face in healthcare. Sometimes, in key theme number 5, sometimes we overlook the wisdom of crowds, and I'll talk a little bit about wisdom of crowds and how that might be more valuable than formal predictive algorithms and analytics, and how you can leverage the wisdom of crowds within your organizations to make better decisions, especially when you have limited data. And then there's lots of social controversy around predictive analytics as well. And we have to be socially prepared to act in some cases where we're probably not. Do we really want to know, if, for instance, if we have a genetic tendency for cancer, how many of us want to know about that if we don't have any kind of ability to intervene? And are we intruding on people's futures by predicting such things? Very important social issues that need to be addressed and thought about, especially in healthcare. So let's introduce a few common concepts here that apply no matter where, healthcare or not. And what I would argue is that it's not man versus machine, but it's man plus machine is what we have to do. And machines, computers, are very good at running through objective computable data. They're not very good yet at these more subjective and fuzzy things. So it's the combination of human subjective decision-making and human knowledge with objective data that produces the best outcome. I'd like to point out that the financial industry got this a long time ago. A great quote from Walter Wriston, former chairman of former CEO of Citicorp, rather. Information about the transactions of money has become almost as important as the money itself. And just a provocative thought, could you cut and paste healthcare for money in that? And what if we gave healthcare away at a discount for free just so that we could collect data for its analytic value and bend that back to healthcare improvement. And then an even further thought of provocation is that what if Health Catalyst, which is a data analytics company, what if we got into the business of building a healthcare system simply so that we could collect the data that we think is important for a better understanding of healthcare? What if we control the entire ecosystem? But the flow and the analysis of data is becoming more important nowadays. I believe it was the chairman of GE that recently said, if you think you're in the business of hardware production now, whatever hardware may be, you're probably in the business of software. And software underlies everything that we're doing now, and data underlies everything that we're doing. And GE actually has a multi-billion-dollar industry right now just analyzing data around equipment failures. So equipment manufacturers and users of those equipment will submit data into GE. GE will crunch that data and return the results. And that's a multi-billion-dollar industry for them right now, just crunching the data to improve performance of hardware manufacturing and that sort of thing. The basic process of predictive analytics is the same no matter what your environment. And even though I've labeled this with patient, you could cut and paste hardware in there, device in there, airplane, automotive, anything that you wanted to. Any kind of noun you can fit into that bubble in the middle of the chart there. In healthcare, though, a new patient arrives. We compare that patient to historical data. So we match that patient's data profile up against past patients of a similar type. We look at the historical trends and outcomes associated with the patients in the past. And then we try to make predictions based upon the patient that presented themselves around that historical trends and outcomes. Then we move on, ideally, to a suggested response. And again, this is where I'm focusing on action here. Predictions alone are not good enough. You have to have a suggested response and intervention. Some people are calling this prescriptive analytics, that suggestive response. Okay? Prescriptive analytics and predictive analytics, two slightly different things. And I might add, especially in healthcare, prescriptive analytics are very, very complicated, even more so than predictions. So if you're in the healthcare industry and people are suggesting that predictive analytics is the next great thing, it's probably 10 years away at best. Finally, you intervene and respond based upon the suggested response. That's where you combine humans and machines to make a best decision about intervention. You fold that intervention and that data about the intervention back into the historical data. You determine what effect that had on the patient's outcome. And that becomes your new learned case. The problem in healthcare is we're not collecting patient outcomes. And so over on the left lower quadrant here, where the new patient outcome is shown in that box, it's an open loop. So you never really have a learned case in healthcare. I mean, we do in some cases where we're talking about things like readmission, and readmission being a form of an outcome. But what we really should be talking about are things like activities of daily living, behavioral status, functional health status, those kinds of things. Those are outcomes, the ability to actually conduct your life. A readmission is a bad proxy for a patient outcome. But that's kind of where healthcare is right now. But without that outcome, you have an open loop algorithm here, and those algorithms can never produce a learned case. So that's an important concept to think about. No matter which industry or where you are with predictive analytics, you have to have a closed loop system of data in order to teach these things how to improve over time. This is actually one of the problems with IBM's Watson, is that because healthcare doesn't have these outcomes, Watson doesn't have a good training set. It doesn't really know what it should be looking for. So until we close that loop and start collecting outcomes data, IBM's Watson will never be able to live up to its full potential. I like to quote Nietzsche in this context, beyond math, there are no facts, only interpretations. Right? And the next slide, I believe, shows what I mean by this just a little further. the challenge of predicting anything human is that our maturity of our mathematical models and frameworks is pretty poor. So over on the left with sociology, the psychology of random violence exhibits one extreme of unpredictability. Physics, electrical engineering on the right, the other extreme. I mean, this is why we can sling a space probe to Mars and have it land within minutes of our predictions and with a footprint that's smaller than a football field. That's what enables us to be predictive, is that the mathematical models in that context are much, much better than our mathematical understanding of human behavior. And so you have to be aware of anything that involves human behavior and predictability of human behavior is still limited by our mathematical understanding of human behavior. And in medicine, we're kind of in the middle right now. I mean, some things are reasonably mathematical, but I'm probably being gracious and putting it in the middle. It's probably further over to the left, even less formal than anti-terrorism. But it is, I think, an important concept just to remember when you're dealing with humans. It's very difficult to predict things on a regular basis. If you're dealing with hardware, aerospace, automotive, those things are very predictable because we've developed models for those over many, many years. One of the concepts that's important here is it's the sampling rate versus predictability. So those of you that have had a chemistry and physics background, you'll remember that the sampling rate and the volume of data in an experiment is directly proportional to the predictability of the next experiment. And so in NSA and Air Force, for example, when I worked in the ICBM industry in the Air Force for a few years, we would instrument those missiles and those rockets for launch, not even really knowing what we might do with the data that we'd collect from it. But every time, we would make some sense of it, and especially if there was an anomaly, that availability of data was very important. Well, in patient care, we think we collect a lot of data, but we really don't. I'm a great example of that. My primary care physician sees me, if I'm lucky, one time a year. That's a pretty bad sampling rate to really understand the complete picture of health that I have. So until we move into biometrics and collecting data outside of clinical encounters, it's going to be very, very difficult for us to accurately predict what's going to happen next in our healthcare. I'll go a little bit further into this. Those of you that might remember your digital sampling theory in calculus, what we're trying to do is describe the analog curve of human behavior and health, right? So human beings live in an analog context. We're not digital human beings, at least not at the physical level. At the quantum level, you could argue that we're digital, right? We exist in quantum states with discrete values. But at the physical layer that we interact and live in the world, we're an analog being. And so what we're trying to do in the collection of data is we're trying to smooth out that curve. We're trying to collect more and more data around that analog curve so that our data points look more and more like that smooth analog curve. And that's kind of digital sampling. That's why physics is so good, because they sample those analog processes. The flight of that missile through space is being sampled at a very high rate. And so the digital sampling looks a lot like the analog waveform. The problem in healthcare is that we are asking physicians and nurses to act as our digital samplers, and that's just simply not going to work. And there was a recent study from the American Medical Association about the need to overhaul the design of electronic health records. When I was at Northwestern, I shadowed my primary care physician during encounters with him, so when I would go in to visit him, and then I would also shadow him on other patient encounters, and I would collect the number of clicks that it took him on a mouse to document a clinical encounter in our electronic health record. And it varied depending upon the complexity of the patient, but it was somewhere around 200 to 300, and in some cases 400 mouse clicks for my physician to open up the EHR, document the encounter, close it all out, wrap it up, and send it off to billing. Now, if I were a physician, I don't know where the breaking point of frustration would be, but I've got to think that it would be less than 200 clicks. So if we're asking physicians and nurses to go to 300 or 400 clicks to close out a clinical encounter, that's ridiculous, right? If I were the king of all physicians and nurses, I would go out to the software industry and healthcare, and I would say, I'm going to give you 50 clicks. You figure out how to design software for me that supports quality of care, efficiency of care, cost of care, but I'm only going to give you 50 clicks of a mouse to do that. You have to figure out how to be more efficient with your software design than what you're doing right now, because I can't be your digital sampler anymore. The human data ecosystem in healthcare is much broader than just the healthcare encounter data that you see here in the lower left of my cartoon. That's just a small part of what we need in order to produce precise predictive models. We also need 7x24 biometric monitoring data about my body as I interact with the rest of the world outside of a clinical encounter. We need outcomes data. Eventually, I think we're going to use consumer data and consumer purchasing data, because socioeconomic behavior has a big impact on healthcare outcomes and costs. We're already starting to dabble in genomic and familial data, and eventually we'll figure out a way, and we'll try to figure out what to do with social data that we collect. But the human data ecosystem is much bigger in a healthcare environment than just healthcare encounter data. And even though those of you that are not a member of the healthcare industry, you can relate to this as a patient, right? Everyone out there has probably been a patient at some time, or will be for sure. And I hope you can relate to this ecosystem of data. Eventually, what I would like to see is economic incentives provided to the patient to participate in their data ecosystem. So I would like to see a reduction in my insurance premiums, for example, if I agree to submit data to my healthcare provider organization, and in return for that, they're going to mine that data and improve my care, lower my costs, and make my care more personal. I'd like to see economic incentives for that provided to patients, and I hope in the future we can do that. I'd like to show this cartoon as well. We think we're big data in healthcare. We talk about it all the time as if we have big data, and I laugh because I think there's a Freudian complex underneath all of that talk. But aerospace is a great example. The Boeing 787 collects 500 gigabytes of data in a 6-hour flight. When I was CIO at Northwestern, and I did this again in the Cayman Islands, I had to calculate our storage requirements for our electronic aircraft. And on average, we collected 100 megabytes of data per patient per year. That's per patient per year, in comparison to the 500 gigabytes of data that Boeing collects in just 6 hours of a flight. And that's why Boeing can predict precisely all things about that aircraft. And that's why we can't predict much of anything accurately about patients and their future as it relates to healthcare. And then, of course, you introduce the complexity of human behavior and free will into that, and it makes the environment even more challenging. This graph depicts the relationship between precision of a predictive model and the additional expansion of data in the ecosystem. So right now we're down here at the asterisk here, the clinical encounter data. But as we add data, consumer data, to this ecosystem, being the first step up, as we keep adding data, outcomes data would be next, biometric monitoring data, genomic and familial data, and then finally social data. It shows the progressive improvement in precision of these models. And so healthcare organizations and as a nation, actually, we need a strategic plan for the acquisition of data around healthcare so that these predictive models can improve. We've spent $30 billion in healthcare on the clinical encounter data on the lower left. The high-tech provision of the Affordable Care Act spent $30 billion on the development of electronic health records that are essentially dysfunctional when it comes to the collection of data about healthcare. What we need is a broader strategic vision at the national level about how to ramp up the collection of data and how to analyze the data throughout this continuum. So let's talk a little bit about this concept of wisdom of crowds and what I call suggestive analytics, not predictive analytics. And by the way, we're about halfway through, folks. I just want to mention that there's a high likelihood we're going to run right up against our hour. I can stay on after that hour to answer questions, and you'll have my contact information, and we can follow up later if there are other questions that you'd like to ask as well. So James Surowiecki wrote a really good book called The Wisdom of Crowds. If you haven't read it, it's a great, easy read, one of those airport library reads. It's loosely based around a process that the Rand Corporation developed in the 60s, I think, maybe the 50s, called the Delphi technique. And it's basically how do you get groups of experts together to improve the subjective decision-making process. And Surowiecki described the conditions required for establishing a good crowd. And these are the characteristics. So you have to have diversity of opinion in that crowd. You have to have personal insights and facts on a topic, even if it's just unusual interpretations of the data, but you have to have diversity of opinion. You have to have a sense of independence among individual members of the group. You have to have some decentralized knowledge about it. So that is, there's not a single person or a couple of people that hold a lot of knowledge in contrast to other members. So decentralized knowledge is very important. And then the fourth part is you have to have some tool and method for aggregating this knowledge and analyzing it for some kind of collective intelligence. And I'm bringing this up because I think we're overlooking the wisdom of crowds. We're underutilizing the wisdom in our own organizations, especially in healthcare, believing that predictive analytics is going to be better. But in the meantime, while we're pursuing that, we're overlooking the experts that exist in our organization right now, and we don't do a good job of leveraging the wisdom of crowds to make predictions that are kind of inherently difficult anyway from a computer standpoint. So here's our second polling question. Doug, did you want to introduce this? Well, let me give a little context first.
Sure.
So this is from the 2014 Southwest Washington State Fair. And this was a real contest. And so Levi Wallace there, he was the guessor. Charlie Brown was the 8-year-old Swift steer. He was the guessee. And Dave Fenn was the owner. And there was a fairly significant prize, whoever could guess closest the weight of this steer. And so the purpose of this exercise, and we're going to ask all of you to guess the weight of this steer, by the way, I kind of doubt, although you never know, that the demographics of the attendees today probably don't have a farming or ranching background. And so according to Surowiecki's characteristics of a good crowd, I bet we don't have a very good crowd today, and I bet we see a lot of variation in the estimates around this weight of the steer, Charlie Brown. So let's do that. Let's move on and get everybody's guesses, and we'll see what the variations are. There
So
we have
again,
it. We'll hold that up for a minute.
Yep. Polling question number 2. Guess the weight of the steer. 405 pounds, 832, 1,824, 2,223, 2,767, or 3,577. And while our audience is responding to the question, Dale, maybe you could tell us what happens if the group does not exhibit really all of the wisdom of the crowd's criteria that you had on the previous slide. So what's the risk if it doesn't exhibit all of those criteria?
Well, bad decisions, basically, Doug, right? And I think those of us in corporations probably see this on a regular basis where we're making a significant decision, but we haven't gathered a diverse group. There's only 1 or 2 very familiar folks. There's a lack of independent thinking among the members of the group, and we haven't. You know, one of the things the Delphi technique does for us is it gives us anonymous collection, which takes a lot of the cultural issues out. There we have the answers. So very interesting. Well, no one guessed 405, which is good. A few folks at 832. So, the guesses weren't too far off. A few folks got it exactly right, and I see down at the bottom some folks had it up to 4,000 pounds. So not too far off. I think the next slide gives the right answer. If not, I'll mention it now. The correct answer is 2,767 pounds. So not too bad. Yeah, there we go. Not too bad for a group that probably doesn't have a farming and ranching background, but a little bit low, 24 pounds. And I'd love to run this with a true group of farmers and ranchers and see what it is. I have a farming and ranching background from Colorado, and I guessed independently that it was 2,400 pounds, so a little closer. All right. Let's move on here. I'm using Wisdom of Crowds, the book, as an example here to describe what I call suggestive analytics. Analytics is not predictive. It's gathering data, and it's suggesting things. It's surrounding a decision with data to influence your thinking about it and kind of nudge you in a different direction. Now, Amazon, if you think about it, when you buy a book from Amazon, a very small portion of the user interface of that screen is dedicated to the book that you're buying. Probably 3/4 of the screen space on Amazon is now suggesting other things to you, like other people bought this book, there are 6 of these books in stock, so you better buy now. Here are the ratings. It's surrounding you with what I call suggestive analytics. Now, Amazon's intent there is to upsell and cross-sell. But we can do the same sort of thing in healthcare by leveraging the wisdom of crowds, collecting data about encounters of similar patient types in the past, and then just exposing that data. There's nothing predictive about this. It's just suggestive. It's not predictive. And it's a lot easier to do mathematically than it is predictive. So just kind of think of that concept. Suggestive analytics, I think, has a big role to play in a lot of different industries where you're leveraging the wisdom of crowds and past behavior without the complexity of predictive analytics. So let's talk about a little bit of predictive analytics outside of healthcare, and I'll start. I'm going to have to pick up my pace here to finish this off. I mentioned, and Doug mentioned in the intro, that I was a CIO in the Air Force. This is a picture of the underground command post at SAC in Omaha, Nebraska. This is prior to 9/11. It's changed. There are no pictures of it post 9/11 anymore. But as you can see, it was a very complex decision-making environment for us. And this is kind of a human interest story, those of you that might not know about it. In the event of a nuclear attack or a national emergency like 9/11, there's a fleet of aircraft that go airborne all the way from the western part of Europe all the way out to far beyond Hawaii, almost to Japan. And dozens of aircraft all go airborne. They form this airborne network. It literally is a network where the planes are communicating via air-to-air communications links. And national command authorities and military leadership get on these planes with the notion that those aircraft are more survivable than being in a ground command center. And then that's me down there in the lower right as a young lieutenant talking to a colonel. That panel in the background is the launch control panel that would allow us to launch all 1,000 nuclear ICBMs from these aircraft as well. So a very dense, very complicated decision-making environment, and predictive analytics is what it's all about. In nuclear operations, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out as a CIO how and where can a computer help make these decisions more accurate. So reducing variability in decision-making and improving outcomes, same kind of thing that we're trying to do in healthcare. And that stressed-out general officer in the middle there is struggling, trying to figure out, what happens if I launch prematurely? Do I start a war that's unnecessary? If I don't launch, early enough and I'm too late, then the U.S. is going to be held hostage, we're going to be defeated. So all of these different things are going through that general's mind, and in some cases, some scenarios, that general will only have between 4 and 5 minutes to make that kind of a decision and decide upon a response and intervention. So I watched all of this for many years and tried to figure out a way to apply computers to reduce the variability, reduce the likelihood of a really bad decision, either one way or the other. And that's what finally exposed me as I was studying healthcare to the very significant lack of computerization and data-driven decision-making in healthcare. We even had political military outcomes that we were trying to achieve. Retaining U.S. society is described in the Constitution. That was an important political military outcome. So everything that we were deciding and working on was based upon how it might affect these 5 and other outcomes. I'd like to tell kind of a funny story. One of the things that we were tasked to do is reconstitute what amounts to U.S. government and U.S. society in a post-nuclear environment. And so we had these very detailed checklists about how to go through that. And one of the first things is, we had to find a base where we could land and reconstitute the aircraft. And we had to find the president or the president's successor. And then right up there in the top 5 is we had to establish the tax system so that we could start collecting revenue and operating the government. And I always thought that was kind of funny. One of the top priorities was getting that tax system back in place. So there are these odd parallels, right, between healthcare delivery and nuclear delivery. That is, we have clinical observations. In the military, it was satellites and radar. In healthcare, it's laboratory results and it's radiological imaging. We were trying to predict the diagnosis. Are we under attack or not? And to what degree is the severity of this attack? We don't have much time, especially in an ICU in healthcare, to make a decision. Same thing in the military. 4 minutes of first impact when you're talking about 50 to 100 million lives that might be under attack. And then what's an appropriate treatment and intervention? Do we launch on warning or not? And what are the consequences of that? So people think it's a little crazy that I made this transition from the military and nuclear operations into healthcare, but the parallels are a lot more direct than what might first appear. This is another kind of, one of my cartoons about the data feeds into national intelligence. So I went on to work for the National Security Agency, and it is also an environment that's trying to collect subjective and objective data. In healthcare, there's a thing called a SOAP note, and it's a technique that physicians in particular are trained to produce, and it's a thought process as well. So as you're treating a patient, you want to combine your subjective assessment of the patient as a human being with the objective data that you have, the vital signs, lab results, that kind of thing. You want to step back and make an assessment, and then you want to put forward a plan. That's called a SOAP note or a SOAP technique. And that's exactly the same thing that the Director of National Intelligence is doing, CIA, FBI, same kind of thing. And they're surrounded by all these different forms of intelligence, some of them being very discrete data, some of it being human intelligence data. It's exactly the same thing, the very parallel environments between national intelligence and healthcare decision-making. Another thing that's interesting is we had registries in NSA, and we still have registries for terrorists. In healthcare, we have what are known as patient registries. So all the diabetic patients are in a registry of patients. Congestive heart failure patients are in a registry. Asthma patients are in a registry. And those registries are defined precisely so that we understand sort of the demographics and the number of patients we're dealing with and the characteristics of those patients in those registries. Same kind of thing applies in anti-terrorism, actually. And there are 3 phases, just like there are in healthcare. You might become a terrorist. Well, you might become diabetic, and we want to intervene before that risk becomes too serious. The next step in that is you are a terrorist, and that is that you participated in an act of terrorism. And then the 3rd phase is you were a terrorist. We reformed you, we jailed you, or you died, one of the 3. And the same sort of thing parallels healthcare, actually. You might have congestive heart failure. If so, we want a risk assessment of that, and we want to intervene before you progress. But once you progress, we want to have a plan there for intervening as well. so that the progression of your disease and congestive heart failure doesn't carry you on to the next phase, which is you were, right? And ideally, one way to get patients off of that patient registry is to cure their disease, or to at least slow it down to the point that you can have a normal and healthy life. Same kind of parallels then between the two. So, another polling question here, Doug.
Thanks, Dale. Again, polling question number 3. Which is easier to predict? Predicting the weather, predicting human behavior, or neither? They're about the same, and both are nearly impossible. And while our audience is responding to that, Dale, maybe you've got some perspective as to certain industries or even companies that may be better at trying to predict human behavior than others. So are there certain industries or maybe even companies that you've seen that are doing their darndest to try to figure out human behavior?
Well, given the elections last night, you could argue that the pollsters have figured out how to predict human behavior. But it's not really predictive analytics in the context we're talking about today, because a poll is a different thing. A scientific poll, statistical sampling type poll is different than a predictive algorithm. So for instance, if you were trying to model the outcome of the election based entirely upon past elections, that would be predictive analytics. That's not taking a poll. A poll is just a sample of the larger population. So people get confused a lot of times that what Nate Silver is doing, for example, is predictive analytics. It's not really predictive analytics. It's just formal polling. Okay, so there's our responses. And what's interesting is I've given this poll now probably half a dozen times, and these numbers are almost exactly the same. I think we all kind of agree, or the majority of us, that it's easier to predict the weather. And one of the reasons is we've dedicated vast sums of money, decades of research, decades of computer technology evolving to try to predict the weather. We haven't done that as much in predicting human behavior in these different areas, and especially not so in healthcare. And so the mathematical models in weather prediction are much further along than they are in human and sociological issues associated with human behavior. Okay. So let's keep cruising along here. I won't go into this slide too much. It's a kind of a fundamental risk assessment equation for predicting terrorist risk, but the same kind of equation should also apply to healthcare, and that is what's the probability of a patient acquiring a particular disease or syndrome, what's the probability of it affecting that patient if they do acquire it, and what are the consequences on that patient. Same kind of thing is starting to emerge in healthcare as an important concept, especially the costs of intervention and mitigation. One of the things, and I'll talk about this a little more later, but one of the things we've learned over the years in healthcare is that you can invest a lot of money in intervening in a healthcare process, and you can move the needle very little in terms of actually changing that patient's health. So how you intervene is as important as what you're going to do to intervene. So again, I won't go through these, but these are some of the scenarios that we were trying to avoid. At NSA, my team was tasked with protecting the nuclear command and control system of the U.S., and we were constantly trying to hack into it and do all these crazy scenarios to it, and the national labs would work with us, and we developed these various forms of technology to try to break into the U.S. command and control system. And these are the risk scenarios that we were trying to test against and trying to avoid, nuke flash being the most severe and dull sword being the least. And the point I'm trying to make here is that in healthcare, you need to have a sense of the risk scenarios, right? We have a risk algorithm. You have to have a sense of the risk scenarios that you're trying to avoid, and then work backwards from those scenarios with your data. This is kind of a funny quote. I just want to mention it and introduce the topic. Mr. Sanders, while your 9-year tenure as an inmate has been stellar, our analytics models predict that you are 87% likely to become a repeat offender if you are granted parole. Therefore, your parole is denied. And as big brother as that sounds, it's happening across the U.S. 80% of parole boards now use predictive analytics for case management, despite this problem of predicting human behavior. There's also another form of predictive analytics affecting our justice system, and it's called evidence-based sentencing. So what you saw before that was predictive analytics to address parole violations and recidivism. This is evidence-based sentencing. What's the appropriate sentencing given a crime and a person's background? 20 states are using predictive analytics risk assessments to inform criminal sentencing now. And there are all the variables on this slide that go into that recidivism risk assessment score. This LSCMI is a Canadian company. They're kind of the de facto standard in the legal world for these predictive analytics algorithms. And these are all the variables that they look at to decide what your likelihood of recidivism will be. And it's worth noting that 42% of high-risk offenders under this algorithm with these variables recidivate within 3 years. Kind of interesting, isn't it? So in July of 2014, the Department of Justice sent a letter to the chair of the Sentencing Commission in the U.S. expressing concerns about the use of these algorithms for sentencing and parole. So the data and the technology got ahead of our cultural ability to kind of manage it and really decide whether we really want to be a part of it or not. And it's interesting, in that letter, there's a reference to the fellow that wrote the book about Moneyball. And Moneyball and Billy Beane, we had Billy Beane out as a speaker at our conference a few weeks ago. Billy Beane has really brought data and predictive analytics to the forefront of modern culture. And it's interesting that there was a reference to him in this letter from the U.S. Department of Justice to the Sentencing Commission. So interesting sociological issues. eHarmony is another, very commonly used, and all these dating services use these predictive analytics. And they have 320 profiling questions in their compatibility match processor, 29 dimensions of compatibility. These are all kind of techie numbers here that the computer science folks in the crowd might appreciate. Not as big a data set as I thought it would be. And then there are all the various dimensions of compatibility that eHarmony uses to predict whether folks on the website are going to be compatible or not, and whether they should be matched or not. Now you might ask yourself, what's an outcome, right? Going back to that early diagram, what do you think eHarmony's outcome is? How do they know what a successful outcome is, and how do they then close that loop in their algorithms? Well, more recently you've seen them advertising on TV that they have a marriage rate of something like 42% or something like that. So the outcome that they're seeking is marriage. That's the thing that's going to close the loop on that algorithm for them. Okay, so I would suggest that maybe we ought to have an eHarmony for MDs so that we have better patient engagement. And that's more than just a joke. We're actually working on this to better align a patient with a physician so that there's better engagement between the two. And I certainly would appreciate that myself. There's an interesting project called the Good Judgment Project, which is funded by the Director of National Intelligence. I'm a member of this group. I'm one of the forecasters. And the basic question is, can groups of non-experts with access only to open source information predict world events more effectively than intelligence analysts in the CIA and NSA with access to classified information and other internationally recognized experts on these fields? Well, what's interesting is the non-expert forecasters in this group of 5,000 are 65% better than the experts and 30 to 60% better than predictive algorithms. So this, again, gets back to that notion of wisdom of crowds. There are some things that we're trying to predict about human behavior that just might not be easily computable, at least not now. So leverage this kind of wisdom of crowds. Okay, so a little more on predictive analytics inside healthcare. As I mentioned earlier, this is a diagram of what I call true population health management, and 80% of healthcare is affected by things that lie outside the traditional boundaries of healthcare. So in the kind of the middle of the diagram, you see clinical care, 20% of the effect, social and economic factors, 40%, physical environment of the patient, 10%, and then human lifestyle behaviors at 30%. Well, what we've been asking under the Affordable Care Act is for healthcare delivery organizations to expand out from that 20% into this 80% above and below it. That's what accountable care organizations are all about, pushing out into what amounts to becoming a public health system. And that's why so many healthcare organizations are struggling, because they've never had to do that before. All they've had to focus on is the 20% here, access to care and quality of care, and then the social and economic factors, the physical environment that's been kind of outside the scope of influence for a typical hospital or healthcare CEO. But under the Affordable Care Act, we're forcing these healthcare delivery organizations to look at population health and start functioning more like a public health system. But what we'll find with predictive analytics is that most of the healthcare factors, or most of the factors that influence healthcare, actually fall outside of the things that we can easily influence, which makes intervention and action very difficult. We found at Northwestern that socioeconomic data matters a lot. So at least 30% of patients fell into one of these categories in their ability to participate in a clinical protocol. They either had a cognitive disability, an economic inability, physical inability, geographic inability, religious beliefs that conflicted with the treatment protocol, some sort of allergy or contraindication to the protocol, or they were simply, voluntarily non-compliant. They didn't want to participate. But yet we're expecting accountable care organizations to somehow affect this, and I don't think it's realistic. Primary care physicians just aren't in a position to do that. But if we're going to become a public health industry, we have to figure out how to treat these patients with more personal care that addresses these issues that we typically haven't addressed in the past. So, along those lines, in your experience, another poll question.
Thanks, Dale. In your experience, which of the following socioeconomic factors are most commonly associated with hospital readmissions? And again, for the non-health care folks participating, I suspect there'll be a little bit of groupthink here. But while the group is responding to the question, Dale, is there some data that would lend to the credibility of a correct answer here? So is there A, a correct answer, and B, is there any data to support that correct answer?
Yeah, good question, Doug. We did analyze this data at Northwestern, and I'll share the answers so as not to bias the poll. But there is some data to support which of these we should be addressing, both as an industry as well as a nation, that we traditionally haven't addressed in the past.
Great.
Yeah, those are the results. And folks have done a really good job of again, wisdom of crowds here. An amazing correlation with what we actually found in the data. Economic inability to participate was the predominant factor that we identified. Cognitive tends to imply that there's a cognitive shortfall, but that's not always the case. Sometimes it's just a matter of a language barrier, or it's not as if these are significant cognitive disabilities, but that affects, as it turns out, we found a kind of a cognitive disconnect between the healthcare provider and the patient about 40% of the time. So yeah, very interesting, very interesting. Okay. Again, a quick comment on this. Return on engagement is a concept in healthcare. We found that you could invest millions of dollars, literally, to try to change the behavior of patients that were considered the most high risk according to predictive analytics. But you never really could get those patients to change their behavior or the state of their health care. And so we're going to have to make some tough decisions around this concept of return on engagement. How much money do we invest on which patients to affect the greatest improvement in healthcare? And a lot of times it's not the highest risk patients that a predictive algorithm would identify. It tends to be lower risk patients that are on a very bad trajectory, but they can still be intercepted and intervened. And I'm not going to go into the details of this, guys. It'll be in the slides, but these are some of the variables around readmission and things. I think we're already up against our hour. They're there for reference. It's pretty common commodity kind of things there. These are common causes for readmission in healthcare. And this is thanks to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So predictive algorithms aren't addressing these kinds of things. And again, this is patients have no family or other caregiver at home. They didn't get accurate discharge instructions, didn't understand the discharge instructions, discharged too soon. None of this is going to show up in a predictive algorithm, but this is what the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation found, and we know what to do to prevent these readmissions. So a big expensive algorithm isn't going to do anything to improve this. We already know what we should be doing. These are some other areas on this slide of what we're trying to predict in healthcare. Again, I'll leave these for reference. We don't have to go into the details here. This is another diagram of that notion of closed loop. So taking the output of analytics about a patient specific, pulling that back to the point of care with suggestive analytics. The antibiotic assistant, if you want to Google that for more information, that Intermountain was that product I talked about earlier that was very successful in a very specific use case, but lots of money invested in that. Not sure it's scalable. And then again, just kind of closing questions and thoughts that I mentioned earlier, that action matters, humans are tough to predict, socioeconomic information is very important. We don't have much data in healthcare. Don't overlook the wisdom of crowds, and be prepared for social controversy in healthcare as we apply these concepts. And in reflection of yesterday's events, keep in mind that sometimes these predictions are wrong. So when it comes to humans, it's not always easy to predict. And I think that's it. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, Dale, and thanks everyone for participating in another one of Plant Moran's webinar series. As a reminder, there is a certificate at the bottom of the session that you can click on to obtain your CPE widget. And also there's a link at the bottom of the slides for additional information relating to the content that was presented today, as well as other information on previous Plant Moran presentations, and last but not least, Dale's contact information. There is a complete calendar of upcoming events for Plant Moran webinars. You can find those at webinars.plantmoran.com. And thanks everyone again.
Thanks everyone. Have a nice day.